are the places that you're dealing with? You have to indicate that.
You never, you know, it's a joke a minute
it's
here.
It's difficult to see because there are also the clouds. But, you know,
So,
please use this as you need.
My God. All right. I would like to begin by thanking Marco for this warm welcome and a few pedagogical hints. And I want to thank Phyllis Lambert and the staff of CCA and Kim Forster and Martine de Vletter for all the help they've given me personally on previous visits to the CCA. And I would like to thank also the benefactors, so to speak, who've contributed to, I don't know, the installation of this archive here. And I suppose I should also apologize for being late, although that's not exactly our fault. Everything's happening fast except the link between Montreal and New York. And of course, it is a lesson, I think, talking of global, in global warming. I mean, all of this rain have to have something to do with the melting ice cap, I think. And the other thing I would like to begin with is these two impossible questions. I mean, it's a sort of, boy, are they impossible? I mean, they sit together very well. They're both more or less unanswerable, I think, or anyway. And the other thing I would like to say is that, yes, my efforts in this regard is to try to produce a 5th edition. There have been 4 editions, and the way in which the editions have been made is that every so often the publisher would say, I think you should add a chapter. I think his wonderful term was to keep the book alive. It's going to keep me alive, but in any case, that's what happened. And it meant that certain errors were never corrected, and also certain other lapses nothing was done. But now, of course, with the arrival of digital technology, it's possible that the 5th edition will have a complete set of footnotes, and also certain spelling errors will have been corrected. The question as to whether it's possible to write a global history is particularly pertinent to me, since I've spent the last year attempting to achieve just that, with the intent of producing a 5th edition of the modern architecture, so as to cover in some measure contemporary architecture in the non-Eurocentric world, above all in Latin America, Africa, China, the Middle East, South Asia. But here I kind of hesitate because it's not so clear how I'm going to, develop that. And the fact is that, okay, this won't be a global history either, because certain parts of the world I've decided to leave out. For instance, there'll be nothing on Russia. Oh, that's very good. Or on, obviously, a Russian. Yes, and nothing on Eastern Europe, or not much, and also parts of Southeast Asia will not be recognized. But the other thing is that certain parts of the world will be recognized. I mean, Canada above all. And, actually, that leads me to talk about what I perceive as being cultures of architecture, rather strong cultures of architecture. I think there's a strong culture of architecture in Canada. I think there is a very strong culture of architecture in Ireland, and also, as a matter of fact, of recent date in Bangladesh. So that's something that fascinates me. Exactly how am I? Is it a myth? Is it a delusion? How am I? Why do I think that? I can't really completely answer my own question. With respect to the term global, which is in itself a loaded term, as Jacques Derrida was at pains to point out, proposing mondialization instead of globalization for ideological reasons, we need to note in passing that the millennium provided an occasion not only for assessing the evolution of 20th century architecture, but also for recording the state of architecture at the beginning of the 21st century. As far as the former is concerned, this was exhaustively covered in a 10-volume survey of modern architecture across the world for the entirety of the century in a magnum opus published by the Chinese Architecture and Building Press in the year 2000. Under the title World Architecture, a Critical Mosaic. In this instance, the world was divided into 10 regions with the aim of selecting canonical examples through the adjudication of 10 expert panels. I believe that Phyllis was even a member of one of these panels. In this way, the publishers achieved their target of 1,000 canonical works for the century at a rate of 100 buildings for each decade, for each region, thereby revealing the emergence of a modern culture of architecture across the world in relation to greatly varying rates of modernization. My role in this instance as the general editor was limited to formulating the ground rules of the selection procedure, which meant that there had to be a certain adjustment in certain countries in terms of the distribution of so-called canonical buildings, because the rate of modernization in certain parts of the world was so, what can we say, reluctantly or dormant vis-a-vis modernizing. And the other part was appointing the regional editors who were charged with, well, not the own solely, but partly nominating potential canonical works for each region and with supervising the selection process. These regional editors were also expected to write a critical overview of the entire century for their specific region. And one of the strangest things about this 10-volume encyclopedic survey is that it has been so badly distributed, you can almost not find it anywhere. So I don't quite know why the China Architecture and Building Press, after all this effort, should fail in this particular sector. This encyclopedic publication was accompanied by a similar millennialistic enterprise on the part of the Spanish editor Luis Fernandez Galeano, who published at around the same time the 4 volumes of his atlas, surveying the state of the world architecture at the time of the millennium. And here this is the volume dealing with Africa and the Middle East. In this instance, he adopted a similar method of appointing regional editors who, in some instances, were exactly the same regional editors that had appeared in the Chinese survey. This time, without the aid of expert panels, but nonetheless taking responsibility, the editors that is, for the selection of canonical pieces and writing an essay covering recent developments in each region for the first decade or less than the first decade of the century. These editors were at times the same figures, as I've already said, but in this instance, the world was divided into 4 vast continental sectors, with each sector being covered by one of the 4 volumes as per 1, America, the Americas, North and South together, 2, Europe, 3, Africa and the Middle East, and 4, Asia and the Pacific. One might think that this is also slightly Eurocentrically loaded, but and in any case, that's how it panned out. And also the other peculiar thing is that these actually very beautiful, well-illustrated volumes backed by a Spanish bank, which banks only support cultural affairs, I think, as far as publications are concerned, for some reason in Latin countries, not in France, but in Spain and Italy in particular. These encyclopedic picture books were followed by 2 mega academic works, which leave me kind of overwhelmed. A Global History of Architecture by Francis D.K. Ching, Mark Jarzombek, who is here, and Vikarakma Madita Prakash, published in 2007, and Architecture Since 1400 by Kathleen James Chakraborty in 2014. All of these various global overviews published in and around the year 2000 were in striking contrast to the Eurocentric received histories of the modern movement, starting with the idea of a movement altogether that had, I believe, its origin in the first edition of Otto Wagner's Moderne Architektur of 1898, wherein Wagner remarked that today the cleft between the modern movement and the Renaissance is already larger than that between the Renaissance and antiquity. And with these words, I suppose we can say the movement was launched. And the fate of the movement, I mean, if we can still refer to it as such, is now altogether questionable, which I think in a way also explains part of the unanswerable question, is the global architecture possible today? This incipient Eurocentric bias of Otto Wagner would be reinforced 30 years later when Bruno Taut published his Moderne Baukunst, Europe and America in 1929, which inaugurated, as it were, a whole series of Eurocentric come North American histories dealing with the evolution of modern architecture, among which we may surely cite Nicholas Pevsner's Pioneers of Modern Design, 1936, Siegfried Gideon's Space-Time and Architecture, 1941, Rainer Banham's Theory and Design in the First Machine Age of 1960, all of which, and particularly the last, culminated in my own Modern Architecture, a Critical History of 1980. From the standpoint of Manfredo Tafuri, these are all operative histories. That's to say, as much as I understand the word operative, historiographic accounts that in the main advocate the cultural values, the supposedly progressive cultural values embodied in the works under consideration. Banham's Theory and Design in the First Machine Age is exemplary in this regard, in that he concludes with the geodesic paradigm of Buckminster Fuller, seen not only as the inevitable technocratic destiny of a techno-scientific age, but also as a value-free validation of popular desire seen to be the be-all and end-all of modernization. I mean, on Banham's part and perhaps also on Fuller's part. And it is Alan Cahoon who takes him to task immediately after the book is published in 1960 by saying, well, you've said that Villa Savoie and the Struckenart House are masterpieces, but in the end you dismiss them both in favor of Fuller's geodesic paradigm. Fuller's great cultural non sequitur when he, aggressively said, most architects don't know how much their buildings weigh. It rather says a lot about Buckminster Fuller, I think. It is ironic that my History of the Modern Movement, which took me a decade to write, because I couldn't get it into the format of the World of Art series which it was to appear in, should appear in the same year as Paola Portuguese's Venice Biennale of 1980, which was the first architectural biennale ever to be staged in Venice. Under the somewhat transatlantic slogan, the end of prohibition and the presence of the past, this eminently postmodern exhibition was focused about the so-called Strada Novissima, which we see here. This is a sort of composite image, which shows the elevations at the top and then this slightly weird perspective down the center of the Arsenale. This Strada Novissima was set up by Portuguese within the Arsenale as a perspectival scenographic axis, lined on both sides by eclectic postmodern facades designed by rising international stars of the moment, ranging from the populist decorated shed of Robert Venturi to the rationalism of Leon Krier. And this strange, cement-rendered front by Krier has a distinction that it was, at the architect's insistence, built out of so-called real materials, out of bricks and mortar and cement rendering, wood, of course, so to speak, as opposed to the scenography of all the other facades, erected significantly enough by the set-building operatives of the Italian film industry, Cinecittà. This ironic-mannered revalidation of the time-honored street occurred at a moment when the universal automotive megalopolis had already manifested its inherent antipathy to any kind of street. This much was acknowledged in my modern architecture in the first edition, above all through recognizing that the last British new town of Milton Keynes, dating from 1972, had been designed in accordance with the precepts of Melvin Webber's non-place urban realm, as set forth in his book, Explorations in Urban Structures of 1963. I mean, basically, it was a kind of mini orthogonal American grid, but a little bit because of then the British were still in the European Union. So the grid was actually supposedly a 1 kilometer square grid. You know, had to be bent a good deal because the Buckinghamshire landscape was not really conducive to having actually perfect grid laid on top of it. But it is the last new town, no more new towns after that. So much for the modern movement, and it was very much an automotive operation. Webber also coined the term community without propinquity, along with non-place urban realm. 1981 saw the formulation of the concept of critical regionalism by Alex Zonis and Liane Lefebvre in their 1981 essay, The Grid and the Pathway, which appeared in Architecture in Greece, respectively featuring the rival Greek architects of the late 50s, namely Aris Konstantinidis and Dimitri Pikionis, the one for the trabeated rationality of his Yanina Museum, shown here, and the other for the eminently tactile landscape laid into a site adjacent to the Acropolis, so-called Philopappou Hill. And the museum was exemplifying the grid, because the essay, The Grid and the Pathway, and the staging ground, so to speak, outside the Acropolis was, of course, the pathway, and as readable as a sort of in tactile terms by the feet and the gait of the body as in visual terms. Both men exemplified for me a regionally inflected modernity of which I'd first become aware in the early 60s when working as the technical editor of the British magazine Architectural Design, through which I became conscious of a more intimate, grounded modernity, which could then be found, in my view, in the European city-state, as opposed to the impoverished cultural context of the post-war British provincial city, which would be even more diminished, of course, by Margaret Thatcher. I had in my mind at the time the symbiotic relationship that seemingly obtained between Gino Valli and Udine, between Matthias Ungers and Cologne, between Ernst Giesel and Zurich, and even between Carlo Scarpa and Venice. It was just this all but mythic reciprocity between the city and architect that made me susceptible to the critically regionalist thesis, particularly when I was able to situate this idea in relation to Paul Ricoeur's 1961 distinction between universal civilization and national cultures that also had that name. And actually, this text was recommended to me by Dalibor Vézelay, who instead of writing a review, as I asked him to, of modern architecture critical history, said, what you're trying to talk about has been covered by Ricoeur in this essay. And this essay, I must say, had an enormous influence on me, because it became the substance of my response to Portuguese's Venice Biennale, as set forth in my essay, Towards a Critical Regionalism, 6 Points for an Architectural Resistance, first published in 1983 in Harold Foster's The Anti-Aesthetic, Essays in Postmodern Culture. And yes, I'm showing now, I mean, these are kind of, you could say, weird illustrations. I'm showing publications with by which I have been, rather unduly influenced, I would say. Well, not only because I happen to appear in this one, but also because Jürgen Habermas, his own reaction to the Biennale was the first essay, in fact, to be published in this anthology. Where Banham ended his 1960 account of the evolution of the modern movement with the reductive nihilism of Buckminster Fuller, in my opinion, whose work would prove to be the seminal parti pris for both archigram and the dematerializing pragmatic technology of the Anglo-American high-tech movement, and I would also say he would have some influence, more measured, I think, on Cedric Price. Instead of that, I will conclude the first edition of my history by arguing that high-speed film and mediatic imagery had an ambiguous, not to say deleterious, effect on the materiality of architectural form, a sobering conclusion which echoed perhaps Walter Benjamin's image of the Angelus Novus, which appears in his 1940 thesis on the philosophy of history, which was the last text of his life, with which I'd opened my account, the first edition, along with the illustration of Ledoux's barrière being demolished in 1865 in order to make way for the étoile that was to be constructed around Chalgrand's Arc de Triomphe, which had been completed in the early 1830s. And somehow these two things together, I mean, this exemplified for me the angel of history. If you will recall, you know, that the angel is being pushed back into the future by a wind, a storm that blows at him and deposits wreckage upon wreckage at his feet. And he would like to close his wings and restore everything that's been smashed, but the wind is too powerful for him. The wind, he says the wind is blowing from paradise. The angel of history is being blown back into history before, continual demolition of the world, really. The second edition of my history that appeared in 1985 ended on a more upbeat operative note in that I added an entire chapter devoted to an exemplification of my critically regionalist polemic in which I featured a number of architects who had hitherto been excluded from the account, beginning with Utsen's Bergsvej Church, completed outside Copenhagen in 1976, and including among their number of Alvaro Siza from Porto and Dao Ando from Osaka, whose respective works could be seen, in my view, as having been inflected not only by the topography and the climate, but also by the subculture in which each was situated. Utsen would prove to be of crucial importance to me, not only for the emphasis he placed on non-Eurocentric architecture, but also for his concern for the corporeal experience of the body being, as we find this evoked in his 1962 essay, Platforms and Plateaus, in which he contrasted the experience of the subject standing on a Mexican pyramid to the suspension of a body on the light, flexibly resilient timber-framed floor of a typical Japanese house. From this, I think, phenomenological standpoint, Utsen saw the other as the potential of a pre-industrial worldwide building tradition, which without excluding Ricoeur's universal civilization, which Ricoeur identified with universal technology, was nonetheless capable of sidestepping the ecologically negative impact of technological maximization. Jürgen Habermas's Theodor Adorno Prize address of 1980, that in effect was his response to the postmodern asceticism of the Venice Biennale of 1980, still posited the idea of the unfinished modern project as a liberative promise still capable of realization in the foreseeable future, as this had first been outlined in his essay, Technology and Science as Ideology, first published in his book, Towards a Rational Society, Student Protest, Science and Politics, that was published in 1968. I mean, very timely at the very moment of the student revolt. Today, however, almost half a century later, in the midst of a seemingly irreversible climate change, some of which I've just experienced, we are subject to an escalating technological modernization that borders on the condition that Arnold Galen has identified as post-histoire, in which the various technosciences each develop their own internal discourse and, to quote Galen, slowly progress, since in the meantime we want to keep on believing in it, is displaced towards the periphery of facts and consciousness, and there is totally emptied out, end quote. He's alluding to the moment when, as he puts it, progress becomes a routine and the world enters into a vast, more or less visionless somnambulism of change without change. You know, everything is constantly changing, but in some ways there is no fundamental change. In his 1961 essay, What is History?, the distinguished British historian E.H. Carr recognized that all history must to some extent be the consequence of the time and place in which it is written, and that a relatively objective history must not only depend on recognizing the interdependence of facts and values, but also on an a priori critical stance from which this interplay is interpreted. From this point of view, any history, and above all a concise, non-Eurocentric history of world architecture, must depend on pre-establishing a set of precepts by which one decides to include and exclude any particular work, architect, and or social, economic, cultural, or political impulse, or political upheavals. You could even say demographic upheavals, I think, operative at a given moment in time. And this is the raison d'etre behind this otherwise unduly elaborate account of my response to the advent of architectural postmodernism in 1980, seen as a general condition, by me, seen as a general condition rather than a mode of stylized asceticism. In his exceptionally perceptive study, The Seeds of Time, of 1994, Frederick Jameson points out that critical regionalism distinguishes itself by being anti-modern and anti-postmodern simultaneously. In, as he puts it, a negation of a negation, and I quote, that is far from returning us to our starting point or from making critical regionalism into a belated form of modernism. Jameson paraphrases me in seeing the potential for an other architecture, irrespective of whether it is Eurocentric or otherwise, as being subtly being a subtly condensed edification in which tactile, tectonic, and telluric factors displace those visible parts of a building in favor of privileging the joint as a primordial tectonic element. And I'm quoting Jameson, the fundamental nexus around which a building comes into being, that is to say, comes to be articulated as a presence in itself. This is Jameson, end quote. Elsewhere in the same text, Jameson continues, quote, critical regionalism would seem to stage a new way, in a new way, an aesthetic strategy for including and diffusing technological modernity. Jameson illustrates this point by emphasizing the seminal importance of Utzon's Bargsby Church. Oh, by the way, this is his little diagram of critical regionalism versus stylistic postmodernism, in which you see joints on the bottom left-hand are anti-scenographic, tectonic, tactile, telluric, and he writes the anti-grid. And it's related to rearguard marginality, to local resistance. I mean, he also criticizes this aspect of it, this sort of quasi-political aspect of the idea, as opposed to the pair above, the trans-avant-garde, in fact, in brackets, trans-avant-garde pluralism at that date, anyway, the term was used, corporate hegemony, part element signifier as the anti-system on the right. So, but to come to, this is actually the two elevations of Utzensbergsvej Church outside Copenhagen, 1976, and a site plan in this particular drawing. And what we're looking at is, in fact, of course, prefabricated concrete panels slotted into cast in situ reinforced concrete frame and covered actually by greenhouse glazing. And his point is, I think, yes, Jameson illustrates this point by emphasizing the seminal importance of this church, where repetitive modular use of prefabricated panels is countered by a bespoke cast in situ reinforced concrete vault over the main space, you see here in the section, that transcends the symbolic role of the vault in Western culture by alluding to an equal but other spirituality, which by virtue of its undulating sectional profile may be associated, albeit unconsciously, with the form of a Chinese pagoda. I mean, of course, it's not a Chinese pagoda, but it's not a Western vault either. It's a folded, I mean, technically, of course, it's a folded plate, in situ concrete plate, in situ concrete folded plate structure. But in my view, and it appears in many of Woodson projects, this is this kind of theme of the pagoda on top of an earthwork, which is, well, actually Sydney Opera House is exactly that, or two pagodas on top of an earthwork. It's just this kind of hybrid complexity I have in mind as the touchstone by which to maintain some consistent principle of inclusion and exclusion within the confines of an unduly condensed, overarching, non-Eurocentric history, the undeniable hubris of which may be justified by the role that it might eventually play in acknowledging the critically significant value of works arising in parts of the world hitherto regarded as underdeveloped and or marginal. And in fact, in my view, much of the work that is now emerging in the erstwhile periphery is of a quality that far surpasses that which is being achieved today in the former centers of modern architectural culture. I have in mind, in particular, work in India and Bangladesh. Whether a global history is still possible today, even under the rubric of a critically selective account, still remains to be seen, not only in theoretical terms, but in terms of someone like myself who's currently engaged in trying to write one. And here the problem is not only this question of what do you include and exclude, but also given the size of a book, and given a publisher who still wants to keep one book instead of, no publisher wants to publish 2 volumes of anything anymore. I think Leonardo Benevola was the last person to achieve that. And given this limitation, of course, as I hinted at the beginning, it's only quasi-global because, huge chunks of the world's architectural production is just simply left out by a totally arbitrary decision on the part of the author, or for that matter, on the part of the author in combination with the publisher. This kind of, these negotiations have yet to be kind of finalized, I'm sorry to say. In my 1983 text, Towards the Critical Regionalism, more important perhaps is the subtitle, 6 Points for an Architecture of Resistance, I attempted to specify those qualities which I consider to be pertinent to the cultivation of a resistant non-spectacular architecture that, in addition to a detailed articulation of its tectonic form, should first comprise a liberative disposition of its spatial program, second, an appropriate inflection of its surface in terms of the light and climate in which it is situated, and third, that the work should be equally responsive and, in fact, be integrated into its topographic context, all of which is kind of bordering on banal truisms, but are still, given where we are in architectural schools today and also in architectural practice for that matter, I think it's worth repeating. Lastly, I suppose I would like to say that there is today, in a moment in which is neither, in my view, modern nor postmodern, a fundamental demand to reconcile the unavoidable tension between tradition and traditions and the act of innovation. I mean, I'm very influenced by Zygmunt Bauman arguing, that you cannot have innovation without tradition and you cannot have tradition without innovation. Apart from that, I suppose I would have to say I'm very influenced by Gianni Vattimo, who has pointed out that edification has the double meaning of building and of edifying. And in this sense, architecture has always possessed a cosmogonic, ethical dimension. And it is to values such as these that I'm returned in my attempts to write a partial global account. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's both very flattering and challenging to be here. Responding to the call, I decided to have a two-part talk today. First, a few words about Ken's contribution to global architectural history as far as I see it, and second, a few words from me, my take on the issue. And I titled this talk, Critically Now, an Intertwined History of Architecture Around the Globe, as if it's somewhat of a migrant speech from a new event series that we started at Cornell. I hope this title will become more evident, not only because of the impossibility of separating history from criticality, while giving a homage to Kenneth Frampton, but also due to the critical project attached to the version of the global architectural history that I would like to present today, and especially now. Ken, if I may, Ken's book, Modern Architecture: Critical History, was a paradigm-shifting survey because it demonstrated the multiplicity of modern architectures that grew in Europe and North America. Unlike the linear, monochronic narrative endorsing a sequential set of practices with a limited cast of characters, which had been constructed in the initial surveys, one can think of Pevsner here. Modern architecture critical history gives us many more nuanced historiographical tools to deal with the complexities and the multifacetedness of the world we live in than those who might update the initially established narrative by extending it to the present in the form of a technologically determinist historical singular narrative from pre-industrial to industrial to the digital architecture. Even though Ken does not hide his approving or critical evaluations of buildings, this does not always lead to a one-liner favoritism. Even though he is politically engaged with the world events from a Western Marxist point of view, he understands architects in their sociopolitical and economic contexts without deeming them as powerless slaves to the ideology of capitalism, as we might say early Tafuri did. Instead, reading Ken's texts would somehow leave you with a taste of both anxiety over the state of the world and a cautious optimism about the role of architecture. The book offers its readers a more diverse view of modern architecture, a richer heterotopia of trajectories. These trajectories, chapters if you like, run parallel or converge, overlap or diverge, follow out-of-sync courses or have different durations. Reading the book from front to back, in reverse, or starting from a random chapter, one would imagine a world of simultaneously present events with out-of-phase durations that historically overlap, intersect, or miss each other. The end of the book never happens. New chapters get added all the time, and I see that new are coming. So this comes in contrast to previous accounts that tried to explain modern architecture in its entirety with a homologous time conception, often with a telos, which produced a singular narrative, usually with a fixed starting point and an end. Whether this was a handful spatial principles packaged as international style in an exhibition, or a technologically determined transition story from crafts to industrial design, or one that claimed that the entire course of modern architecture lied entirely within the production cycles of capitalism. Modern architecture, a critical history, emerged out of a context of intellectual transformations of its time, mid-1980s that is, where thinkers were discussing the need for the death of meta-narratives and openness to the multiplicity and diversity of social phenomena. Scholars of Western Marxism were advocating that the left reclaims democracy in its radical, plural form by acknowledging the positive proliferation of new subjects and new struggles of history. Only the due acknowledgement of the plurality of social struggles and the open-ended possibilities for the emergence of new subjects of history would bring the necessary transformations of the classical Marxist models. Even though Kant's book was also almost exclusively about white male architects of Europe and the United States, it participated in questioning the then established history's time conception and its status as one single story of Western progress. And that's how I think this book has contributed to the global history of architecture so far. Moving on to some of the other texts, since this event is organized in celebration of the arrival of Kenneth Frampton's archive at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, I would like to say a few words about the very short slice of time when I personally witnessed the accumulation of these documents. From what I could follow in literature and witness personally, I have always been astonished because of the different, almost opposing receptions of Kant's essay, Critical Regionalism, in the United States on the one hand, and in West Asia and South America on the other hand. People read it in a variety of ways, but this article has captured the imagination of a wide range of contemporary architects from around the world, because many, outside the established centers of Europe and North America, must have felt an affinity with its cause. Perhaps it's no coincidence that Kant still remains one of the few scholars whose articles and lectures are full of inspiring examples designed recently by architects from a variety of geographies and increasingly of genders, which few in the audience would have known beforehand, before hearing the lecture. And his palette constantly increases because artists and architects, many of whom are not recognized out of their local contexts, sent him their portfolios, self-printed books, and works that had been published in obscure journals. In a world where corporatization of architectural office allows for only a handful of dominant practices, at a time when only a few architects secured the majority of commissions all throughout the globe because of their star power, and in the context of a business model where firms such as ICOM swallow small offices into its body like a leviathan, the status of architectural practice in the sidelines has become increasingly more vulnerable, whether it has been marginalized due to location, gender, office size, or position. I have a sense that the gap between Kant's professional status and intellectual position has created a necessarily paradoxical situation, which allowed him to become the voice of the margin, even though he himself has been positioned in the established center. And this must have shaped Kant's classes and the direction of the PhD program at Columbia University, where I did my doctoral studies. This program was distinguished at that time from its counterparts for being a place where you could acquire exceptionally solid and comprehensive knowledge about the history of architecture, not just the usual suspects, but also unknown, underappreciated, and under-researched, but evidently relevant and high-quality works that you could hardly study elsewhere. There I started shaping the theoretical foundations of the global history of architecture that I would like to present in my remaining time today. Even though introductory courses of architectural history hold an indispensable place in professional education, the canonic surveys had for long relied on a conceptual schema that lent to a monophonic and monochronic narrative, prioritizing white male architects. Most of us teaching the history, theory, and criticism of architecture today would find ourselves in need of unteaching the survey in subsequent classes to open space for the convincing critiques raised in recent years by the postcolonial feminist ecology and critical race studies. And the quick fixes in the form of a new global history classes can hardly hide their contradictions, as long as they extend conventional concepts and values to the rest of the world in a usual epistemic imperialist fashion. How could we possibly settle too easily on the conclusion that the architectural establishment, which has so far earned little credibility and collected minor experience in any area but the West, can suddenly claim to have found the formula of global history? I sometimes think curiosity is Kant's strongest method, and that's why I think he has contributed to the global architectural history, and curiosity is surely the indispensable facet for the production of any knowledge. At the same time, there's also a recent tendency to write the global history of architecture by perpetuating art history's 19th century field categories, such as Islamic architecture, Asian architecture, Chinese architecture. Much like the Western non-Western divide or the conservative clash of civilizations theory, this model conceives and separates the world into a few self-contained and isolated geographical entities. It still begins by placing the Western canon at the center first, only to add epilogues later. Such a model is too vulnerable to maintaining the same geopolitical schema that produced the traditional canon in the first place. The global history of architecture that I try to teach offers a model, I think, for critically evaluating both of these positions. By drawing on the translation theory of my book, Architecture and Translation, which was written partially here at CCA. This book argued that there's enough evidence to rewrite the past in a much more intertwined way than what conventional categories allow for. And it developed a theory of translation as well as a related vocabulary to explain the global movement of architecture. Recent theories have presented countless reasons to reject the conventional notion of translation as a neutral bridge between cultures or as a second-hand copy that fabricated the myth of the original. I define translation as a transformation that takes place with the transportation of people, ideas, photo images, objects, information, technology from one place to another. So when translation is defined like this, as a transformation that takes place during the act of transportation, it avoids passive metaphors and depoliticized explanations. This definition of translation inevitably invites the consideration of the socio-political and economic context and the agency of all parties in cross-geographical vectors. Translation, understood in this way, advocates for a commitment to a new culture of translatability from below and in multiple directions for a truly cosmopolitan ethics and global justice. So the model for global, or the word I prefer to use is intertwined, the model for a global history that comes out of this translation theory would present a much more connected world, which I would like to offer as an alternative today. This global history can be written deeply about one artifact alone, as long as it explains this artifact with both the local and the global forces acting on it. It is less interested in completing history than making it more relevant. For an introductory class of such a global history, I do not necessarily propose to smoothly and efficiently circumnavigate the whole planet to tell a grand narrative in a universalizing fashion, but I propose to focus on multiple interconnections between parts of the world. Like an ever-growing additive mosaic, rather than a top-down panoramic gaze that discards alternative for the sake of one narrative, such a history would concentrate on some points. Those points may be a building, an architect, or a movement at a certain time and place. Those points would be organized chronologically, roughly, and evenly distributed geographically. And those points can be connected in multiple ways, or have been connected in multiple ways in history. In this framework, each of these points is discussed in detail, both in relation to their immediate context and from a global perspective, namely by tracing the translations from several places that act on it. The evenly distributed points and their given connections together start making a mosaic of the world without creating a perception that they are self-contained and isolated entities, and without zooming out from one allegedly original place into bigger territories. Namely, this mosaic demonstrates how the world is intertwined. Places are affected by each other even when they are segregated. Architectures are reciprocally translated rather than disseminated from one center to the rest of the world as if the rest was purely derivative. Whether there was a peaceful or a violent, a collaborative or a competitive, an espousing or a defying conversation, an intertwined history perceives each location in a given time and place in some relation to other locations. And let me run through a few sessions to make this more concrete. For instance, the Global Network of Revolutions, a session in the, or you might consider this as a chapter in a book, or a session in a class, would be a good example where I discuss French, American, and Haitian revolutions together. The assumption that the world is divided into a few distinct civilizations has been used to justify the postulation that modernity was an exclusively European and North American invention, which was disseminated to the rest of the world and thereby erased other presumably frozen architectural cultures, or at least rendered them unworthy of scholarly study. Nowhere is this claim as firmly posited as in the narratives that show purely Western origins for the inventions of people's sovereignty during the Enlightenment revolutions. It's a curious fact that many histories mention French and American revolutions separately as big leaps of humanity, as benchmarks of self-governance, as the moment of the foundation of republics based on Enlightenment values such as freedom, equality, and human rights. But they hardly spare a word for the other revolutions with the same values that were happening simultaneously, such as the declaration of the Haitian Constitution in 1801. Additionally, the triumphalist narratives of established surveys fail to register the hypocrisies of these revolutions. The status of slavery exposes such a contradiction within the American Revolution, which secured many civil liberties but maintained the idea of slavery. The Haitian Revolution is a marker in human history precisely because it was the first constitution to both declare people's sovereignty and abandon slavery. The architectural symbols of these revolutions exist within a similar hierarchy. When one looks for the architectural symbols of the French Revolution, one would think of Soufflot's Church of Sainte-Geneviève, its transformation into Pantheon in the hands of Quatremère de Quincy, its path to becoming the secular monument to French Revolution. While thinking of the American Revolution in architectural terms, one would reflect on the University of Virginia by Thomas Jefferson. However, one would be short of buildings if one were to discuss the Haitian Revolution with architectural examples, as these are barely researched or recognized. The Sanssouci Palace in Milo, under Henri Christophe's rule, which is in ruins today, is one such architectural example that is waiting for more scholarly attention and an exploration into its direct or indirect relation to thinkers such as Toussaint Louverture. Teaching an intertwined architectural history that shows the co-emergence of the French, American, and the Haitian revolutions is therefore much more than a whimsical gesture, but a breaking down of the symbolic system that has long maintained the foundations of Eurocentric history. And one could indeed present an intertwined history in many other sessions. When discussing Industrial Revolution, one can not only look at the impact of new materials, technologies, and mass production on architecture in London, Paris, and Chicago, but also discuss the strong cause and effect relations between industrialization and colonization in India and North Africa. Crystal Palace is not only a benchmark of transparency, new modular construction techniques, and the rise of the machine, but also, through its displays, the Orientalist divide between Progress West and the underdeveloped East, perceived to be in need of Western civilization. A geopolitically conscious global history shows how industrialization in one part of the world depended on the colonial exploitation of another, and the role of urban planning and architecture in this story. Just to go very quickly, an intertwined history of Art Nouveau in Belgium, France, Spain, Austria, and Ottoman Empire, and the instinct impact of Bauhaus as a school in India would give evidence of traveling theories and form-making principles. A global history of modern houses would allow us to observe the emergence of modernisms through the work of not only Le Corbusier, Mies, and Frank Lloyd Wright, but also Juan O'Gorman, Sedat Erdem, and Sutemi Haraguchi. Gender inequality and feminism can be discussed through houses and household technologies designed by women, including Eileen Gray and Margareta Schutelowski, both in Austria, Germany, and Turkey. Women's key influence in the development of modernism can be observed through the houses of not only Rietveld Schroeder, but also Frida Kahlo. And the participation of space in segregating women can be analyzed in houses or can be questioned in houses of not only Adolf Loos, but also Esra Akcan. And I would like to add 2 additional points about writing and teaching a global history of architecture today. One of the indispensable components of my class or any survey class are the seminars on stage, where graduate students make a presentation on a building or an architect of their choice in front of an audience of other students. In this way, the master students decide who gets additionally included in the survey, and in this way, it's not only the faculty, but also the students who together shape the content. The seminars on stage indicate both the participatory content of this class and the necessarily incomplete and open state of global history today. The global histories today are unavoidably limited by the scholarship and translations that currently exist, which are themselves generated in and published by institutions that have long blocked the chances of this history. So the lack of architectural scholarship so far exposes our current state of knowledge that is full of unsayables. This makes global history incomplete at best. And my final point loops me back to the beginning of the title, Critically Now. As I was writing this talk, memories involuntarily took me to a time when I first arrived in the United States, and I carried out an interview with Ken to be published in a Turkish magazine about his book Studies in Tectonic Culture. It was the same year that George Bush had won the elections, even though everyone around me had promised that this was not going to happen. Yeah. I remember Ken answering my questions by relating them to the results of the recent elections quite frequently. A political, not necessarily partisan commitment that never found concrete reverberations in the design culture at Columbia at that time. And this makes me think a relevant intertwined global history of architecture today not only develops the very critical tools of the worlds that we have been living so far, but also responds to the long overdue need for history to become much less marginalized and much more in conversation with the design culture in architecture schools and elsewhere. In that spirit, this term we started the Critically Now series at Cornell as a collective effort of initially 8, but a growing number of faculty in architectural history, design, and technology. This pop-up and growing series hopes to bring together open classes, exhibitions, colloquiums, movie screenings, seminars, studio collaborations, and so on. And as part of this series, we initiated these open classes, which are sessions that are happening now in the spring courses. And 2 of my classes with relevant content were open, the one on fascism, what's fascism, architecture in Germany and Italy, and the other one on modern architecture in countries subject to the recent travel and laptop ban. Some of the images didn't come through. There should have been a little bit more images. So the Critically Now series aims to respond to the current events such as the travel ban, displacement, immigration and statelessness, civil liberties, infrastructure projects, climate change, automation and employment, to name a few, by discussing architecture's role and critical potentials in these matters. And it's expected to shape up and grow in time. And another event, Critically Now initiated and supported the exhibition Architecture Beyond Borders, which is an exhibition, a small exhibition, which asked the faculty to select inspiring architectures from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, the countries subject to travel ban. And the exhibition just went up with 17 participating faculty. So the fact that open class and design exhibition on the history of modern architecture in countries subject to travel ban is happening at the same time is perhaps a modest but certainly insufficient step towards the studio history collaboration that I'm talking about. Anyway, so to conclude, we live in a world where rigorous critical thinking about the long-standing Orientalist and discriminatory divides need to find a bigger audience. The criticality of global architectural history today is to be measured by its resistance to turning the clash of civilizations theory into a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is for this reason that I think intertwined history model gains its relevance. Thank you.
I want to thank you. I want to thank Phyllis, Mark, Mirko, Kim, and others for the invitation to speak today and join the conversation with Ken. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to breach a subject which I think is sorely under-discussed. It's often sort of discussed a little bit sort of sotto voce, in and around, but in truth, the problem that we're facing remains really sort of weirdly avoided, often more than discussed directly. In 1978, I was on a Swiss Air flight 52 from Zurich to New York. I just was going to graduate soon with my architecture degree at the ETH, and I was hoping to speak to Peter Eisenman about my work with my drawings under my arm. Standing in line at the back of the plane to go to the bathroom was this gentleman with whom I struck up a conversation. It was Ken, whom I had met a few years earlier in Idra in Greece at one of his many conferences there. He told me that speaking to Peter was a great idea, but a better idea was to get a PhD. And that there was such a program at MIT. I'd never heard of the program at MIT. So I did go to see Peter, and that's another story, of course, but I also went to Cambridge to check out MIT, the PhD program, and so here I am, thanks to Ken. I began my PhD in 1980. And the reason I want to start with a little biography is to note the date, 1980, the date of Ken's book, Modern Architecture, The Critical History, came out. Today, with architectural history as a discipline doing pretty well for itself, we would like to think, it is hard to imagine what it was like in 1980. The history of modernism was not even a discipline. It was taught by people who had worked in the offices of Corbusier or Kahn or Mies, or friends of people who worked in the offices of these people, or were the enemies of the people who worked with these people. My teacher in ETH was Bernard Hösli, who happened to work in the office of Le Corbusier, so we were all trained in the late Corbusian manner. At MIT, when I arrived there in 1980, modernism was taught by a fellow called Moray Smith, an incredible man in his own right. But he taught the history of modernism with these handouts that he made for the students. They're really cute, and actually, you know, they need to be studied, and they're really quite marvelous. This one trying to explain certain types of how a modernist architect comes to design a project. In schools of architecture, architectural historians were largely art historians, who were in turn mostly Renaissance historians, despite what Wagner had wanted. These were the real historians. And I show here a semester poster from the HTC section. This is before I came, in the mid-1970s, with the Renaissance, as you can see, at top, Renaissance, Baroque, and then we get into the interesting stuff, the genius loci, cognition, all that type of stuff. But Renaissance was still, you know, the creme de la creme. No, no. And at the ETH, my history education was taught by the eminent Renaissance historian Adolf Max Vogt. And when I came to MIT, there was, of course, Hank Millen and David Friedman, and I took courses with Jim Ackerman, and then, of course, there was the inimitable Kurt Foster. In the 1970s, Renaissance, in other words, was still the beginning point of an understanding of the modern. Even Colin Rowe would have probably agreed with that. In fact, I am probably one of the last of the historians of modernism to have been trained by Renaissance historians. But Ken's generation protested as long as did mine. Modernism had to be understood in its own disciplinary category, and as having theoretical concerns not tied to art history. The historians who opened that field were, apart from Ken, Stanford Anderson at MIT, Tony Vidler, Kurt Foster, and others, but Ken was most certainly the one who really chalked up the miles. And for people in my generation, this provided a clear opening for a radical rethinking. So when the book came out, The Critical History of Modernism, it announced a new formation. Modern architecture was not for the enthusiasts, not for the amateurs, or for the fellows who worked in Le Corbusier's office. It was for historians in their own right. Today, we accept this almost completely. But at the time, this was more a hope than a reality. After all, the number of historians working in the field could be counted on a single hand. I just named them. Fortunately, many of these historians were also institution builders and great pedagogues who produced several generations of historians in their own wake. But I don't want to really talk about disciplinary historiography, nor am I here to simply congratulate ourselves on how far we might have come. I want to make a claim that points to the question posed by the organizers of tonight's event. What we have is the emergence of the history of modernism, is a way that redesigned the whole question of what architectural history was, or what it perhaps could be. So instead of thinking as we might, that architectural history started in the 19th century and went through the hoops of Schmarzoff and Wilflin and Pevsner and Gideon and the like, I would like to play with the idea that architectural history began in the 1980s as a separation from all that stuff. And that still today, architectural history is pretty much a young discipline. And not only is it a young discipline, but it has been shaped and indeed misshaped by a host of forces that are now outside of our disciplinary arena. So to backtrack, when I began to teach in the 1980s at Cornell, it was not just modern architecture that was the exciting new field. Equally exciting was the fact that sites that I recall from lectures back in Zurich that were taught with black and white lantern slides and taught to sleepy students who would never, ever have dreamed of traveling, were now available to be seen in wood and stone. One could go to parts of Africa, parts of South America, Indonesia, Russia. Fodors, the Blue Guide, the Go-To, were coming out with guides on how to get to places without even spending a lot of money. With this as the background, it was glaringly apparent in the early 1980s that the hand-me-down Eurocentrism could be easily challenged by high-minded intellectuals, indeed as it still is, but not easily replaced in the field of architectural history. The amount of material on which the field was based, namely the list of sites and buildings, had exploded. The result was an information and competency gap of enormous proportions. Not helping was the fact that Eurocentrism was not going to die without a good fight, one that is still being played out in schools of architecture to this day. In fact, Harper's just came out with this book, A History of World Architecture, that has not a single reference to China, India, or Africa. Basically, this Eurocentric book, just putting the world in front of it. That such books can still be published in the 21st century is a scandal. I'm just saying, we're still fighting this stuff, There were, however, generally two responses to the fear of being accused a Eurocentric. One was to insert a non-Western piece into the standard narrative. So in 1989, for example, Hart, in the third edition of the book, added a section entitled Far East that had standalone chapters on India, China, or Japan. And the same add-ons can be found in many other textbooks. And here I just am showing you one. The Euro is that thing, and then there's a plus, right? Somebody wrote a standalone chapter on India, China, and whatever. This is still a rather common approach and clear in its intellectual laziness, limited in its capacity to deal with larger, more complex historical realities. The second response, and more cunning, to the critique was to self-occidentalize. 2004, Jameson's History of Art added the subtitle, The Western Tradition, a phrase that emerged only in the 1950s in the Renaissance and medieval historical context, and escalated in usage in the 1980s in response to the Eurocentric critiques. Self-occidentalism was a safety position where Eurocentrism could be maintained without having to struggle to acknowledge any type of outside to its formation. I'm okay, you're okay. The word West codifies, of course, the obsolete division of the world, whereas the second word, tradition, offsets the notion that the West was associated with modernity and secularism. The Western tradition is more than just an admission that there is such a thing as an expansive world outside of that tradition. It is a type of defense against breadth. It is academic protectionism at its worst. It is clear to some of us, however, that by the 1980s, that the world had indeed changed. It was a new moment in our discipline. And the history of the world asked for a different type of history that went beyond the facile critiques and equally facile repair jobs. So when I look back in the 80s, the issue is not so much who was Eurocentric and who was not, but rather who was world open. And by way of contrast, who championed a mentality of foreclosure, even in disguise. Well, I'm not going to discuss the latter group. That's over wine and beer tonight. But I can say that by the 1980s, it was clear to me and to others, at least who was world open. And one of those was certainly Ken. And world open, I mean not just simply open to the issues of the time, but also open to the questions of teaching and learning and how these things sort of relate to each other. It was a pressing problem, since I had to teach the survey of architecture at Cornell when I arrived, the famous course number 181, in 1987. I was handed an old syllabus and basically told, just use that, don't think too much about it. I put it straight away into the garbage, realizing full well how incomplete my scholarly training was to even come up with an alternative. And here's where Ken's book shone forth. Even though it was about modernism and not about earlier things, it pointed the flashlight in the right direction. If the beginning of the book brought us to Germany and England, to Wertbund, Wright, and the Garden City, the places where we expect the story to begin, the end of the book brought us to Barcelona, Madrid, Helsinki, Porto, Athens, San Vitale, and Tokyo. Needless to say, without Ken, Japanese modernism would have been a different story altogether. He opened up the East to the insistently European, Eurocentric sensibility of the day. Today, we might have wanted him to be even more aggressive, perhaps. But back then, it was an astonishing accomplishment, a testament in sketch form, at least to the idea that modernism was global, and just as importantly, that a scholar had to travel the world in order to speak of the world, a much underrated ethos even today. Apart from Ken, we can also mention Spiro Kostov and a few others who began in the 80s to sort of open up a space for what was then called sort of the non-West. But the various openings in the right direction disguise the main problem of the 1980s, leading me back to my point, the problem of scale. The 1980s opened up a vast array of buildings that no one knew anything about. And it was not just the domain of the modern, it was also and preeminently in the domain of architecture's deep history. And since I was saddled in Cornell, just as I am at MIT, with teaching of the survey, which presumably doesn't mean it has to begin in the 1950s or the 1850s, but somewhere we don't know where, back earlier, I quickly realized that my generation of architectural historians almost unanimously gave up on the problem of deep history. It has to be clearly stated that this has had serious negative consequences that cannot be easily repaired anymore. It has produced something that one can call modernist majoritarianism. If the history of modernism is forced to chase after the illusory avant-garde in all its multiplicities that we will see as a consequence, is the general foreclosure of modernist historiography against issues relating to what is now sadly called the pre-modern, a new discipline that has emerged only in the last 5 years as a catch-all for everything that happened prior to 1900 or 1800 or something like that. I mean, Chinese history is now pre-modern, African history stuff is pre-modern, everything is pre-modern. Anyway, if any of you are deans in the audience and I catch you hiring a job position for architecture pre-modern, you're going to get a letter from me. Nonsense. So even though the emergence of vernacular studies, which took root in the 70s, opened up the conversation about buildings at the lower end of the normative production value, I'm not talking about just vernaculars, the division between high and low, a particular irksome distinction haunting our discipline, since there are also a vast amount of what we might call high-end buildings that have been abandoned, the Borobodurs, the Lalibellas, the sacred landscapes of Tibet, and on and on and on. Sadly, these buildings and sites were off the map back then because no one really knew how to study them or where to study them. There were no plans, there were no sections, there were no drawings, much less no photographs, no scholars. But they're still, in some sense, sort of off the map. Abandoned by architectural history, these sites were embraced enthusiastically by preservationists and nation-centric historiography and ethnographic enthusiasts. Beginning in the 1970s and onward, UNESCO stole the thunder of critically oriented historians, and still today, much of the architectural history in places other than America, and presumably Canada, I'm going to put in here, and Europe, is taught by tradition specialists or preservationists. Nation-centric historiography exploded in the last decades, and more national museums were created in the last 20 years than existed in the previous 100. The vast amount of architectural history that is produced today in these contexts is made out of museums, ethnographic institutions, by preservationists, by legions of amateurs and local specialists, all of which makes it extremely difficult to even know what is meant by the simple phrase, a history of architecture, much less a global history. It is a historiographic predicament of extreme proportions that I argue, and it has to be here that we begin to point out to discussion about what it is global in today's world, sort of contaminated as it is by all these vested interests. I mean, you know, this is built in 1970, but it's not going to be, I mean, maybe Ken will put this in his book, but normally this is not a building you would talk about as part of modern, right? And I don't mean modern looking, I mean part of the modern culture of anti-modernity, nostalgia productions, right, at a large geopolitical scale, right? And the birth of ethnographic nostalgia is a modern problem, right? So in other words, we have to sort of understand how architecture is continuously being produced of all dimensions and scale. And so this is a global question. It's not I'm not trying to say this is good or bad. We have to understand actually the history of all this. So the issue is made worse by the predictably slow pace of scholarship. So let's just look, for example, if you're interested in Machu Picchu. Now, the first tentative reassessments came out in the 1980s, seems like a long time ago, in the form of monuments of the Incas of 1982, not a bad book. And then it got better a little bit, Architect of the Incas and Origins, Machu Picchu, the Sacred Center. Then a much more better book, Machu Picchu, the Civil Engineering Marvel. Oh, now we're getting, you know, now we're you know, slathering on the butter. And in 2010, the brilliant book, A Culture of Stone, Inca Perspectives on Rock, an absolute must, right? So we have to sort of understand that these problems, right, are really very much today. We're still trying to expanding not only in the number of buildings, but we also have to revise our understanding of these sites. And this is multiplied across the globe in thousands of places, whether it's the mausoleum of the first emperor, which is never going to get excavated, and we can only imagine what it would look like, for the ruins of a vast new temple city that were just discovered on the top of Mount Kulen in Cambodia. Pre-Columbian sites are all being discovered as well. One scholar told me we know probably 10% of pre-Columbian sites. So in other words, we're 200 years still in the Dark Ages when it comes to pre-Columbian architectural history. So just as Ken's book made it clear that we should not be certain where the history of modernism is going, and as we heard him speak so eloquently today before, we also have to say, if we point into the other direction, that the center of gravity of architectural history has been also sort of displaced as well. Now compare the shock of ignorance, which still reverberates through, though mostly unheard and untheorized, through our discipline, with the contemporary events in art history. There, in terms of volume, it was the new field of contemporary art that filled the walls of museums and that created a vast new literature all unto its own. As a Canadian art editor, David Balzer wrote, "Too many artists, too many movements, too many works, too many shows, too much discussion. Who could parse all of this?" Well, it's similar in architectural history, right? But it's not just new buildings that are flooding the system, but untold old ones. As far as I know, thousands of new Indian miniatures were not found in some far-off museum. Thousands of new Rembrandts were not uncovered in the tropical highlands of Southeast Asia. Thousands of ruined canvases were not meticulously restored to an inch of the original condition by UNESCO, and others left to rot because it didn't fit some nationalist agenda. So when art historians use the word global, they mean something very different than when architectural historians use them. And still today, we have not adequately faced or processed the shock or to the disciplinary system that this expansion has entailed. For these reasons, the global, in the phrase of global history of architecture, points not to the culmination of an historical project or to some particularly refined methodological point of view, nor to just the addition of Indocentrism to pre-existing Eurocentrism, but to the need to address the expanding, changing, and geopolitically contaminated historiographic landscape of buildings and sites, whether in situ or in ruins, whether great monument or humble barn, whether built in 2010 BC or 2010 AD. But in all of this, we should know what global is not. It is not allied with national narcissism, with ethnographic localism, or preservationist positivism. Global is an imaginary of a certain type of historiographic future, but it also has to have a historiographic edge. An accusatory edge. So when I use the word global in the context of global history of architecture, I mean to say that only now are we able to begin to see certain histories and certain critiques that 2 decades ago would have been even thought impossible. The issue is not about the merits of global history, meaning here the discipline that was formed in the decade ago in the 21st century, versus national history versus vernacular history. The more fundamental question revolves around the emerging dialectical nature, not just of the old word history, but of that new word global. A global history is the site of an unstable and unstabilizing relationship between the inside and outside of history, the inside and outside of the nation state, and the inside and outside of modernity itself and its self-proclaimed legitimacy. So it's from within that paradox that the global of which I speak begins to stand before us in a problem within a problem, as an unknown, as an Archimedean point with no real leverage. It all harkens back to that moment of shock in the 1980s, the shock of the immaturity of our discipline of architectural history, and the need to restructure it in a centrifugal and centripetal way. The global of today, in the context that one can loosely call architecture, rotates at the outer surface of various now fully globalized geopolitical realities. To think global is this not to pronounce it as a method or as a result of some pre-requirement of some liberal fantasy of inclusion. It is rather to see, first of all, its actual absence, forcing us to do away with the material objects of its potential referentiality. We need the word to stand in as a sign of what is not there. We need it also to point to the possibility of the signification of something to come. This understanding of global, when added to the word history and to the word architecture, is an exteriority to the disciplinary mashup that defines our current state of affairs. It speaks to a promise that is yet to be fulfilled and that will not be fulfilled for a long time to come, and that most likely will perhaps never be fulfilled. But it needs to be pronounced just as critical was pronounced back in the 1980s. Thank you.
Bonsoir. Please excuse the event is already continuing longer than we expected, and we heard 3 great contributions on this question, can there be a global architecture history today? We propose that we keep on having a short conversation of 3-4 questions, and then open up to questions from the audience. And we will limit it to 2-3 questions maybe, and plan to continue for another half an hour, so please bear with us. And first of all, thank you, Kenneth, Esra, and Mark, for your wonderful, intriguing, yet quite different takes on this question of what a global architectural history can encompass and what the challenges are, and also the possibilities. And I would like to enter into discussion provoking with the first observation that I believe that all your presentations can be seen in the context of globalization, have to be seen in the context of globalization, because this is the time that you are conditioned by in your observations, and that this phenomenon of cultural globalization conditioned by the capitalist system somehow accelerated and intensified over the times of writing and thinking, and also has been theorized and understood differently in economic, political, cultural, and social terms, and the literature makes clear that those terms are inseparable. So as a common base of all your 3 different approaches that, to my understanding, are all informed by a deep humanism, challenging the risk of Eurocentrism somehow, is that you all try to come to terms with modernities in different geographies, different modernities. and that out of different historiographic perspectives, various approaches of writing modern histories of architecture, but also epistemological and methodological challenges that then were gathered under those terms: post-structuralism, postmodernism, deconstruction, and also most recent approaches, post-colonial studies, ethnic studies, and the perspectives on other moderns. And yet, despite this commonality, I think, in your approaches, there's differences regarding periodizations, key terms, and purposes. And I would like to start the discussion by Ken asking you to what extent your approaches, especially having written modern architecture and then entering into the phase of turning to a critical regionalist argument, somehow were responding to geopolitical, economic developments, namely globalization, and later on the formation of the European Union. And maybe as a counterpart, the question to what extent this notion of critical regionalism somehow might have been informed by your education, by the studies at the AA, at the Department for Tropical Architecture.
Yeah, well, yes, I suppose I was, I must have been influenced by these studies. Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew were the direct professors of that program, and I was the guinea pig, amongst others, other guinea pigs. It was the first time that they'd given the program before Otto Königsberger gave it a rather different character, but it was a moment of naive innocence. You could say a kind of post-colonial moment also, because Fry and Drew had worked in India with Le Corbusier, but then also were working in Africa, in Ghana and elsewhere. Many English architects at that moment were, and that was the point of, in a way, if you wanted to be cynical, the point of the starting a section on tropical architecture was in fact to give kind of new substance to that rather short post-colonial moment when British architects not working inside the tight little right little island would go off to the former, the independent imperial states, and perform professional services there and keep their offices open. I mean, that would be a cynical way of looking at it, but but certainly it must have had some impact on me. But I was thinking after this evening's presentations that my involvement with this slightly embarrassing term, critical regionalism, which I seem not to be able to recover from, was really galvanized by this essay of Paul Ricoeur's Universal Civilization and National Cultures, and then important that civilization singular and cultures are plural, and important that he would identify universal civilization as universal technology. And then he says somewhere, not all cultures can withstand the impact of universal civilization. And he also says, he identifies culture as being ethical and mythical together, that the ethical, mythical identity is sustained by culture, basically, was his implication. And I thought at that time, and I still think now, and I thought even more listening to Mark, or to both of you for that matter, that, I thought then, but it would be also true of Western civilization, that, the idea is that Western civilization can withstand the impact of its own universe, of its own technology, but it's not clear that it can, particularly not when it comes to architecture. And so when I shifted ground because of the embarrassment of this regionalism business, particularly when lecturing in the States and students would say, but there is no regionalism here, Anyway, I decided that I would sort of focus on this tectonic business, another slogan. And, but I called it Studies in Tectonic Culture. And actually I had in my head, and I've never declared this, that it was modeled on a Marxist text of the, I think, immediate post-war period by a British Marxist called Studies in a Dying Culture. So, in a way, secretly, Studies in Tectonic Culture is Studies in a Dying Culture. Because the impact, coming back to that point, of this technology, and in a way, you touched on this sort of aporia of global, of what is all has been neglected or is ruined, or no historical work on it, and no capacity, or not very much capacity, to make up for this lapse, this huge, vast lapse. And made me think that, some of this is also, it's still this problem of this kind of collision in a way between what is left of culture and the impact of technology. The two things are it's a big drama, I think. And that's what gives, of course, the Benjamin image of the angel of history such a poignant feeling, I think.
To shift the discussion to the challenge that we're all facing, to engage in a global architectural history from today's perspective, 21st century, the question is, what are the challenges of this intellectual project that you're all engaging? And of course, there's new knowledges and cultures and languages, and also different projects to be taken into consideration. I wonder, Mark, you have been in your writing focusing on different languages used. What are the central terms that you find important to engage with, but also the problematic terms that you are working with and against to dismantle, to come up to a contemporary understanding of architecture culture?
Okay. You want terms? That's what.
I mean, you spoke about the vernacular, something that was widely discussed and that can also somehow countered.
Basically, in a way, as trying to explain global is a sort of a holding for a new terminological space. In some sense, the terminological, vernacular is great. It worked for a while. It doesn't work now, right? Certain terms just worked for a while. They were very important as a way to energize, to focus, to drive a certain argument. But all of a sudden, it collides with all sorts of other things, right? So now we're in a weird, I think, where no terms are working, no concepts are really working. Everything is collided and slipping and sliding on top of each other. And, this is a problem for us, right? And on top of that, right, we're dealing with just a massive amount of stuff if we want to do global in any sort of legitimately honest way as a scholar, right, that just overwhelms the system. Our epistemologies are not prepared for the scale of this, right? I mean, the Chinese did this, with you, this massive thing. I mean, how much is enough, right? But we are realizing now, looking back at it, that it was a scale problem. So I'm just trying to theorize scalehood, right, of the problem, right? Before it just gets to the question of, well, Ken's going to figure out what he wants to write about, and I'm going to figure out what I write. So these are sort of in some sense, one drop-down level of the problem. Of first, there's the shock of scale, which is a trauma to, I might say sort of a psychological almost trauma to the system that we've been in denial of, right? We let the preservationists do their thing, and no one really wanted to know about it. We sort of, oh, what they're doing. Right? And we let other people do everything, right? And all of a sudden we realize we have to stop. I mean, what they're doing to the Parthenon is an obscenity. Why don't we not? Why does nobody care about this? What they did to Newgrange. What is another upset. I mean, I can just, whenever I travel around the world, I go to these places and go, my God, what have they done? And then we go to these ethnographic museums all over the place, right? And we wonder, well, how do we critique those? How do we engage those as modern problems, not as nostalgic stuff, in a globalized wash of tourism that we just don't want to know about. We better damn well know about this stuff. This is huge amount of architectural history is produced by these people, right? And in East Europe, this is all, you know, associated with national centrism, right-wing stuff, conservative political agendas, you know, and to not incorporate these knowledges right into an understanding of what architectural history is global is a problem, right? So I think that the term is right, sort of the geopolitical crisis that we face of what architectural history, right? And architectural history, the way I was trained and taught, was very careful and calm and this and that. I mean, you do your stuff. We had, you know, microhistories, right, from Tafuri. We're supposed to, I mean, we were told anything that's you know, that's bigger than a scale of a building, right, is illegal, right? You're supposed to do your microhistory and do it damn well and publish it and get tenure, and that's all you do in your entire life, right? That's why no one in my entire generation did anything like the scale of a textbook. We were told this was bad. This is German. This gets you to Hegel and to Nazis and God knows what, you know?
You're critical of the concept of the nation and the state, and
yeah, you know,
rather
but we abandoned the problem of scale, right? And we did a little little histories, and then all of a sudden we wake up one day, we go, my God, there's a world out there, right? And it was controlled by art historians. I mean, no offense.
Esra,
all right.
in your theorizing, that method, that tool of translation plays a role, and I wonder to what extent that notion of the nation somehow still plays an essential role in defining those spaces of translation, those contact zones that you're talking about in your writings. And on the other hand, of course, there's this difficulty of coming to terms with industrialization, but also the imperialism and colonialisms attached to it. And thus I wonder to what extent are you somehow taking up that challenge in trying to ensure a post-colonial approach in your writing?
Yeah. I mean, going to what Mark was saying, how the tools or the concepts that have been produced for a specific place and time is not necessarily working that properly when you are working outside of that time and place. I mean, obviously, anyone whose scholarship tried to engage with countries that have not been in the canon so far have been facing that question for a long time, and that's why I think having some credibility working on scholarship on these countries that are that have been pushed outside previously is important for writing a global history of architecture. I mean, if we want to just avoid extending our terms in an epistemic imperialist fashion, I think it's important to have that credibility or curiosity or some, let's say, research time dealing with those terminology questions. So architecture and translation, as you say, was precisely that. I mean, I realized that terms such as regionalism were not necessarily completely fitting into the architects that I was trying to understand. And in that sense, nation, I totally understand that we cannot really have a nation-based architectural history of architecture structure because nation is really, you know, if you think of world history, it's a very short slice of time. You know, it doesn't necessarily explain architecture of the countries when their nation states have not been formed. But for when you're looking at the period when the nation state has been formed and is important, I think trying to avoid the concept of nation is also an artificial imposition. I mean, in a way, for instance, for the time period that I'm writing in the architecture and translation book for the plays, every architect is obsessed with this idea of nation. So if you want to understand that architect, you cannot avoid the concept of nation. So it's not really about rejecting or endorsing a concept a priori, but it's about whether it fits that particular artifact that you're looking at. And nation, in that sense, is very explanatory for a certain period of time in world history, for definitely many architects who were trying to have a national specific modern architecture in their own practice. I mean, in order to understand those architects, you cannot avoid the word nation. So I'm less for avoiding terms a priori, but more for really trying to understand the period in its own, well, in its own terms would not be the right term, or to find appropriate terms for the artifact at hand. But I also have a comment, sorry, about the previous question that you asked about the relation between globalization and global history. I mean, those terms are sometimes used as synonyms, but it's, I think, completely wrong to use them. And sometimes the global history raises this anxiety because it is associated with globalization. But, I mean, as long as we understand globalization as the expansion of the capitalist market to the whole world, the multinational capitalism, in a way, many of the discussions that have been done under global history of architecture, quote unquote, has not been a celebration of that. But at the same time, we cannot avoid or we cannot turn a blind eye to the fact that some of the scholarship has been enabled because of some of the phenomena that came with globalization, such as opening up borders have allowed scholars to travel, or universities rushing to globalize the curriculum in sometimes very shallow ways by just adding non-Western and so on and so forth. These have been enabling factors for global architecture history. I mean, nobody's living outside of the multinational capitalism, so it would be obviously very arrogant to say global history is not about globalization. I mean, it of course had been shaped and sometimes even enabled by these contradicting forces of globalization. But nonetheless, many of the discussions have not at all been synonymous or endorsing globalization. And obviously, we forget the fact that information technology has allowed dialogue and being able to reach other sources a lot more than maybe multinational capitalism. So if we are looking for anything that has been enabling in terms of recent technological and economic developments, it's perhaps information technology is much more of an enabling factor than.
I mean, one of the things that I think, well, I think this evening is a very interesting sort of conjunction because of, well, I mean, you mentioned just now something which, this question of kitsch, in a way, because you talked about the Acropolis, what have they done to, and you implied, of course, you can often have that reaction today, where the question of, you know, the difference between restoration, preservation, et cetera, is very blurred, and for various reasons, you know, the result is very disturbing. And it made me think of one of the things I think that could be a way of focusing one's energy would be to recognize that cultures in general, but you know, even in a sort of relatively limited time span, have a moment of emerging, and then they reach a trajectory and they decline and they vanish, you know. And sometimes I think when you look at, you know, well, obviously the Second World War eclipsed certain cultural discourse, and it never came back, you know, and another discourse started, but it was certainly not discourse between the wars. And I think one can look at other also ancient architectures and think that a particular kind of quality arises at a certain point, reaches an apex, and also then declines. And that already creates a kind of bracket, I would argue, in which you could focus one's work, you know. And that's one thought. And the other thought is the way in which that rise and fall is sort of driven by a cosmogonic impulse to create a world, right? And I think one of the weak things in architecture schools that you could have somehow, in trying to put these things together, perhaps also in a much too sketchy way, you know, but I think that what is sort of unfortunate about a lot of work being done in schools, I think, is that there's no sense that part of the act of making a work is to make a small world, you know, for the subject, quote, or subjects, you know. And I think what, if you put it onto another scale, the rise and fall of a cultural trajectory is also connected to this. Yeah. And I think the split between teaching of history inside architecture schools and what happens in the studio is as bad as it's ever been, really, this schism. And it's very unfortunate because I think when I felt looking at your Critically Now stuff in Cornell, I sensed, what could be made as a contribution from a history theory program inside the School of Architecture, to the work of the school itself. If only one can bring up the level of discourse that this could take place, because I mean, that's one of the impacts, I think, of what you were just talking about, the digital and the informational system, and which is also a universal technology, is it tends to eclipse discussion, because the whole speed of this kind of exchange of information is overwhelming. People lose the ability to have a discussion. I think that, anyway, when you talk about the, I don't know why I'm doing this, but when I think about, this overwhelming project that you put on the table, I mean, I think one just has to, at some point, make a choice and decide that you're going to work on a certain sector, right? Because otherwise it's just...
well, yeah, I mean, in the global book, we made time lapse, and then we just sat around the table and said, what do we like? I mean, it was literally as simple as that. I mean, what would make a good story?
Yeah, right.
So for the 13th century, we said, we're not going to start with Chartres Cathedral, we're going to start with Angkor Wat. Built at the same time. Why do we have to start with Chartres Cathedral? Angkor Wat is 1,000 times better, So, we just decided arbitrarily that that's what we would do, right? Because there is no rhyme or reason in a way. So you really have to have a strong sense of narrative at that pedagogical level, right? At the scholarly level, it's a little bit different because you have scholarly agendas you have to sort of account for, right? You can't just sort of say that makes a good story, right? You'll never get published in the JSAH, right? On that count.
To stay in this realm of pedagogy, I mean, you talked about it, Esra and Mark, also your book is a teaching material, first of all. Earlier we talked about the institutional challenges that you're facing, and this is a question to the three of you. What are those challenges, and how do you try to tackle them, and also what are the possibilities in teaching the global project? Mark, you wrote about what are the other options than the global studio, for example, but also in terms of history and theory, how would you teach translation?
Well, you're supposed to answer this question.
I did in my presentation. So, I mean, the class that I presented today is, I think, about teaching translation, understood in a, of course, broad sense in terms of how you understand an artifact in any place and at any time by not just situating it in its, not only situating it in its local context, but also understanding the translations that act on it from the other places. So that's how I understand, and that's how I teach a global architectural history class. But of course it is, as I said, it's just one alternative, and I maybe agreeing with Mark, I find it somewhat unfortunate that most of the discussion, not here but in general, is still stuck on the question whether we should be teaching global history or not, or we should be discussing much more the different models and challenges of different models and so on and so forth. So, so the class that I presented is just one alternative. I'm not at all presenting it as the alternative, and it's also incomplete, but it is one way of using the translation theory to teach a global architectural history.